There are battles in life that leave visible scars, and then there are battles that leave invisible wounds. The most dangerous conflicts are often the ones no one else can see. They do not begin with shouting, threats, or obvious acts of control. They begin quietly, almost unnoticed, inside the mind. Long before someone controls your actions, they attempt to influence your thoughts. Long before they shape your choices, they try to shape your perception. This is why every serious battle against manipulation starts in the battlefield of the mind. If someone can convince you to doubt what you know, question what you have experienced, and distrust what your heart recognizes as truth, they have already gained ground without ever touching you physically. That is why understanding the importance of your mind is essential, because every healthy relationship is built on clarity, while every manipulative relationship is built on confusion. The human mind was created to process truth, make wise decisions, and recognize right from wrong. It is where convictions are formed, hope is nurtured, and purpose is strengthened. When your thinking is healthy, you are able to evaluate situations with wisdom instead of reacting out of fear. You can distinguish between genuine love and unhealthy attachment. You can recognize encouragement instead of control. But when someone intentionally fills your mind with confusion, constant criticism, contradiction, and emotional pressure, your ability to think clearly begins to weaken. This does not happen overnight. It happens one conversation at a time, one accusation at a time, one moment of self-doubt after another, until eventually you begin questioning yourself more than the person manipulating you. One of the earliest signs of psychological manipulation is that you stop trusting your own judgment. You replay conversations repeatedly, wondering if you misunderstood something that seemed obvious. You apologize for things you never intended. You feel guilty even when you have done nothing wrong. You begin carrying emotional burdens that never belong to you. Instead of asking whether someone else's behavior is unhealthy, you start asking what is wrong with you. This shift is not accidental. It is the result of repeated mental pressure designed to move your attention away from truth and toward insecurity. Confusion has tremendous power because confused people struggle to make confident decisions. A person who knows the truth can stand firm, but a person overwhelmed with uncertainty becomes easier to influence. That is why manipulation often sounds contradictory. One day you are praised, and the next day you are criticized for the very same qualities. One moment you are told you are deeply appreciated, and the next you are made to feel like a burden. These emotional highs and lows create instability. Instead of living with confidence, you become preoccupied with trying to regain approval. The focus of your life shifts from living with purpose to managing someone else's unpredictable emotions. Fear is another powerful weapon that attacks the mind. Fear whispers that leaving will make everything worse. Fear convinces you that no one else will understand your situation. Fear exaggerates the consequences of standing up for yourself while minimizing the cost of remaining silent. Little by little, fear begins making decisions that wisdom should have made. You stop speaking honestly because you fear conflict. You stop setting boundaries because you fear rejection. You stop pursuing opportunities because you fear criticism. Eventually, fear becomes so familiar that it feels normal, even though it quietly steals your confidence, your joy, and your freedom. Guilt also becomes a heavy chain within the mind. Healthy guilt helps people recognize genuine mistakes and encourages growth, but unhealthy guilt is manufactured to keep people emotionally dependent. You begin feeling responsible for another person's anger, disappointment, or destructive behavior. Every disagreement somehow becomes your fault. Every emotional outburst is presented as a reaction to something you supposedly caused. Over time, this false responsibility becomes exhausting because you are constantly trying to solve problems that were never yours to carry. Instead of living with peace, you live with relentless self-examination, hoping that if you change enough, the conflict will finally end. Self-doubt quietly grows in this environment. Confidence does not disappear all at once, it erodes gradually. Each criticism chips away at your certainty. Each accusation weakens your trust in your own perceptions. Eventually, you hesitate before expressing even simple opinions because you expect to be dismissed or corrected. Decisions that once came naturally become sources of anxiety. You ask others for constant reassurance because your internal confidence has been replaced by uncertainty. The greatest tragedy is not merely that someone questions you, but that you begin questioning yourself even when evidence supports your understanding. The mind cannot flourish where truth is constantly distorted. Every lie repeated often enough begins sounding believable unless it is challenged. This is why guarding your thoughts is so important. Every destructive message you repeatedly accept becomes a seed planted within your thinking. If someone repeatedly tells you that you are incapable, eventually you may stop trying. If someone repeatedly tells you that your feelings do not matter, eventually you may stop expressing them. If someone repeatedly convinces you that you deserve mistreatment, you may begin accepting conditions you once knew were unacceptable. What enters the mind repeatedly eventually shapes expectations, attitudes, and behavior. The encouraging reality is that confusion does not have the final word. Clarity begins returning the moment truth is welcomed again. As you learn to evaluate situations honestly instead of emotionally, your confidence gradually returns. You begin recognizing patterns instead of isolated incidents. You stop blaming yourself for everything that goes wrong. You realize that wisdom does not demand endless self-condemnation, but invites honest reflection balanced with truth. Healthy thinking replaces distorted thinking one decision at a time. A renewed mind becomes increasingly difficult to manipulate because it is anchored in truth instead of emotional pressure. It learns to pause before accepting accusations, to examine facts before embracing guilt, and to seek wisdom instead of reacting to fear. Peace slowly replaces confusion because confidence grows where truth is consistently embraced. Instead of living under constant emotional tension, you begin recognizing your own value, your own discernment, and your own responsibility without carrying burdens that belong to someone else. When the mind is strengthened by truth, manipulation loses much of its influence because deception cannot permanently survive where clarity is continually welcomed. Fear, guilt, and shame are among the most powerful emotional forces a manipulative person can use because they do not require physical chains to keep someone trapped. They become invisible restraints that quietly influence decisions, silence honest thoughts, and weaken the courage to pursue freedom. While these emotions have healthy purposes in the right context, they become destructive when someone intentionally exploits them for personal control. A narcissistic manipulator understands that if they can keep you operating from fear instead of peace, guilt instead of wisdom, and shame instead of confidence, they rarely need to force you to do anything. You begin policing yourself, limiting yourself, and surrendering your own freedom because the battle has already been won inside your emotions. Fear is often introduced gradually rather than dramatically. It may begin with subtle criticism, unpredictable mood swings, emotional withdrawal, or harsh reactions whenever you express disagreement. At first, you may simply try to avoid conflict. You choose your words more carefully, hoping to prevent another argument. You become increasingly cautious, measuring every sentence before speaking. What once felt like a normal conversation slowly becomes an emotional minefield where every step feels dangerous. Eventually, your decisions are no longer based on what is right, but on what will keep someone else from becoming angry. This kind of fear changes the way a person lives. Instead of speaking honestly, they remain silent. Instead of setting healthy boundaries, they tolerate disrespect. Instead of making decisions that align with wisdom, they make decisions designed to avoid punishment, rejection, or emotional explosions. Fear slowly replaces freedom. It convinces people that surviving another day of peace is more important than pursuing a lifetime of truth. They begin believing that keeping the manipulator comfortable is somehow their highest responsibility. One of fear's greatest deceptions is that it exaggerates consequences. It whispers that if you say no, everything will fall apart. It insists that if you leave an unhealthy situation, your future will only become worse. It convinces you that no one else will understand your experience, that you are too weak to start over, or that your value depends entirely on the approval of the very person causing your pain. These thoughts become so familiar that they begin sounding like facts instead of lies. Fear rarely announces itself as manipulation. It disguises itself as practical wisdom while quietly stealing confidence and hope. Alongside fear comes guilt, another powerful tool used to keep people emotionally dependent. Healthy guilt has an important purpose. It reminds us when we have genuinely harmed someone and encourages us to make things right. It produces growth, humility, and restored relationships. Unhealthy guilt, however, has an entirely different purpose. It convinces you to accept responsibility for things that were never yours to carry. It teaches you to apologize for another person's choices, emotions, and behavior. Instead of recognizing where responsibility truly belongs, you become convinced that everything somehow comes back to you. A manipulative person may say things that imply their happiness depends entirely on your sacrifices. If they are angry, it becomes your fault. If they fail, you are blamed for not supporting them enough. If they make destructive decisions, they insist your actions push them toward those choices. This constant shifting of responsibility creates emotional confusion. You become exhausted trying to fix problems you never created because you genuinely believe that if you could only become more patient, more understanding, more forgiving, or more accommodating, everything would finally improve. This false guilt becomes especially dangerous because it appeals to good qualities. Compassion, kindness, generosity, and forgiveness are admirable characteristics. Manipulators often exploit these strengths rather than obvious weaknesses. They know that caring people naturally want to help others. They understand that responsible individuals dislike disappointing those they love. Instead of appreciating these qualities, they weaponize them. They turn kindness into obligation, forgiveness into endless tolerance of abuse, and compassion into permission for continued mistreatment. A person's greatest strengths become the very chains used to hold them captive. Then there is shame, perhaps the deepest wound of all. Guilt says, I made a mistake. Shame says, I am the mistake. Guilt focuses on actions that can be corrected. Shame attacks identity itself. It convinces people that they are fundamentally flawed, unworthy of love, incapable of change, and undeserving of respect. This is exactly why shame is such an effective weapon in the hands of a narcissistic manipulator. If someone believes they are inherently broken, they will often settle for treatment that reflects that belief. Shame develops through repeated messages that attack a person's character rather than addressing behavior. Instead of hearing, you made an error, they repeatedly hear messages that suggest they are selfish, foolish, weak, unlovable, or impossible to please. Even when these accusations are unfair, hearing them repeatedly begins to shape self-perception. Eventually, the voice of the manipulator no longer needs to be present because it has become the person's own internal dialogue. They criticize themselves before anyone else has the chance. They reject themselves before others reject them. They lower their expectations because they no longer believe they deserve better. One of the saddest consequences of shame is that it causes people to hide. They stop expressing their opinions because they assume they have nothing valuable to contribute. They avoid healthy relationships because they fear others will eventually discover how unworthy they believe themselves to be. They stop pursuing opportunities because failure seems inevitable. Shame convinces them that remaining small is safer than risking disappointment. It robs them of confidence long before life has the opportunity to reveal their true potential. Fear, guilt, and shame often work together so seamlessly that separating them becomes difficult. Fear keeps you from leaving. Guilt convinces you that leaving would make you a terrible person. Shame tells you that you do not deserve anything better anyway. Together, they form a powerful emotional prison that requires no locked doors because the prisoner has been persuaded to remain inside willingly. The manipulator no longer needs constant control because these emotions begin controlling every thought, every decision, and every expectation. Breaking free begins with recognizing that these emotions should never become permanent guides for your life. Healthy relationships are built on love, respect, honesty, and mutual responsibility, not constant intimidation or emotional pressure. Real love does not demand that someone sacrifice their identity to preserve another person's comfort. Wisdom allows compassion without surrendering truth. It allows forgiveness without abandoning healthy boundaries. It allows kindness without accepting manipulation. As truth replaces fear, responsibility replaces false guilt, and confidence replaces shame, the emotional chains begin to lose their power, allowing peace to grow where anxiety once ruled, and restoring the freedom that manipulation works so hard to steal. One of the greatest turning points in a person's life comes when they stop looking only at individual incidents and begin recognizing patterns. Manipulation thrives in moments that are viewed in isolation. A harsh comment can be dismissed as a bad day. A broken promise can be explained away as forgetfulness. A cruel accusation can be excused as stress. When each event is examined separately, it becomes easy to justify unhealthy behavior. But discernment has the remarkable ability to step back, connect the pieces, and reveal the larger picture. It is the difference between seeing scattered puzzle pieces and finally recognizing the image they create. This is why discernment is one of the most powerful defenses against deception. It allows you to see beyond appearances and understand what is truly happening beneath the surface. Discernment is not suspicion, cynicism, or living with constant distrust. It is the ability to distinguish truth from falsehood, sincerity from manipulation, and wisdom from emotional impulse. A discerning person does not assume the worst about everyone, but neither do they ignore warning signs simply because they hope everything will improve. They understand that love without wisdom becomes vulnerable to exploitation, while wisdom guided by truth provides protection without destroying compassion. Manipulative people often rely on emotional intensity to cloud judgment. They know that when emotions are running high, clear thinking becomes more difficult. During heated conversations, attention shifts away from facts and toward emotional reactions. Instead of addressing legitimate concerns, the conversation becomes focused on defending against accusations, calming someone else's anger, or trying to restore temporary peace. In these moments, discernment invites you to slow down rather than react immediately. It reminds you that not every emotional display reflects reality. Sometimes the loudest reactions are carefully designed to distract from the real issue. One of the first signs of growing discernment is learning to observe behavior over time rather than being persuaded by impressive words. Words can inspire, comfort, and persuade, but character is revealed through consistent actions. Someone may promise change repeatedly, yet continue repeating the same destructive patterns. They may apologize sincerely, but never accept responsibility or demonstrate lasting transformation. Discernment pays attention to consistency. It asks whether actions repeatedly support the words being spoken. Genuine change produces visible fruit over time, while manipulation often depends on convincing promises that never become lasting reality. Discernment also teaches the importance of asking honest questions. Manipulation fears thoughtful examination because deception survives best when no one investigates it. Healthy relationships welcome respectful conversations, clarification, and accountability. A manipulator, however, often reacts defensively when questioned. Simple requests for honesty may be treated as personal attacks. Reasonable concerns are dismissed as disrespect. Instead of answering the question, attention is redirected toward criticizing the person asking it. Discernment notices these patterns. It recognizes when conversations consistently avoid truth instead of pursuing understanding. Another important aspect of discernment is recognizing the difference between conviction and condemnation. Conviction encourages growth while preserving dignity. It identifies mistakes honestly, but also points toward restoration. Condemnation, however, attacks identity rather than behavior. It leaves people feeling hopeless instead of strengthened. Manipulative individuals frequently blur this distinction. They convince others that constant criticism is somehow an expression of care. Discernment separates constructive correction from destructive control. It understands that truth spoken with genuine love seeks healing, while truth distorted by manipulation seeks domination. Discernment also protects against emotional exhaustion by helping people recognize unhealthy cycles. Many manipulative relationships follow predictable patterns. There may be periods of affection followed by criticism, promises followed by disappointment, conflict followed by temporary reconciliation, only for the cycle to begin again. Without discernment, each period of kindness feels like proof that everything has finally changed. Hope becomes attached to isolated moments instead of consistent patterns. A discerning mind appreciates positive moments but refuses to ignore repeated evidence that deeper issues remain unresolved. One of the greatest obstacles to discernment is wishful thinking. It is natural to hope that people will change, especially when you care deeply about them. Hope itself is not the problem. The danger comes when hope begins replacing reality. Instead of seeing people as they consistently are, you begin seeing only who you wish they would become. You interpret every small improvement as permanent transformation while overlooking repeated behaviors that tell a different story. Discernment allows hope to exist without requiring blindness. It acknowledges potential while remaining honest about present reality. Discernment also requires emotional balance. Strong emotions are valuable because they alert us to important experiences, but emotions alone cannot determine truth. Fear can make harmless situations appear dangerous. Excitement can cause obvious warning signs to be overlooked. Loneliness can tempt people to remain in unhealthy relationships simply because they fear being alone. Anger can lead to impulsive decisions that create unnecessary harm. Discernment welcomes emotions as valuable signals, but insists they be examined alongside wisdom, evidence, and truth before decisions are made. A discerning person gradually becomes less influenced by external pressure because their confidence grows from internal clarity. They no longer make decisions simply to gain approval or avoid criticism. They recognize that manipulation often depends upon urgency, insisting that immediate decisions must be made before thoughtful reflection is possible. Discernment resists unnecessary pressure. It understands that truth remains true even when someone demands instant agreement. Wisdom is rarely threatened by careful consideration. Developing discernment also means becoming comfortable with uncomfortable truths. Sometimes recognizing manipulation requires admitting that someone you trusted has repeatedly chosen unhealthy behavior. This realization can be painful because it challenges deeply held hopes and expectations. It may require grieving the relationship you wished existed rather than the one that actually exists. Discernment does not deny this emotional difficulty, but it also refuses to sacrifice truth in order to preserve comforting illusions. Lasting freedom always begins with honest recognition. As discernment matures, confidence grows quietly but steadily. You begin noticing inconsistencies that once escaped your attention. You recognize emotional manipulation before it gains influence. You become less vulnerable to flattery because your worth no longer depends on someone else's approval. You become less intimidated by criticism because you have learned to evaluate it carefully instead of accepting every accusation automatically. Your decisions become guided by wisdom rather than emotional pressure, and your relationships become healthier because they are built upon honesty instead of illusion. Discernment is not a gift reserved for a select few. It is a quality that grows through a continual commitment to truth. Every time you choose honesty over denial, wisdom over impulse, and clarity over confusion, your ability to recognize deception becomes stronger. The patterns that once kept you trapped begin to lose their influence because you no longer view isolated moments as the whole story. Instead, you see relationships through the lens of consistent character, truthful actions, and enduring integrity, allowing wisdom to guard your heart and mind against manipulation that once seemed impossible to recognize.